So we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, just want to take a moment to welcome everyone here. Thank you so much for joining us today for our policy meeting. So today we'll have some discussions about sort of policy EBCD, delayed openings and emergency closings for discussion. And then we'll also be talking about sort of an update on the policies and regulations potentially impacted by COVID-19 and sort of that relationship between the Connect, Restore, and Reimagine initiative, our program. And so we'll hear from two folks there, and then also we'll have some time later this after those presentations are done and some discussion to really think and look at our compliance reports and see if there are any questions or fruitful discussions that might emerge from our as the committee members or the community members look at the compliance reports. And so I will start our meeting. I will call to order our meeting at 3:35 for our policy committee meeting. And I believe our first presenter is going to be Allison, if I'm not mistaken. So Allison, it's so good to see you. And I'm going to pass the floor to you and just do a reminder of also, if we can keep these presentations to 20 minutes so that we can make sure that we have robust time for robust discussions, that would be great.
Great. Thank you, Committee Chair Brooks, and thanks for letting me be here. I'm here to talk about the policy on school closings. And this is a kind of interesting time to talk about it given the year we just went through. So this policy is at its regular time to be up for renewal, but it also makes sense to do it at this particular time given everything that just occurred in the last year. And it's a kind of a good time to take fresh eyes to look at this and think about potential changes. I want to put a huge thanks to our Chief Legal Counsel, Josh Sivan, who really got started, who's been leading a policy committee that has really gone in depth to look at upcoming policies and involve other departments in the development of them, that I think has resulted in much more thoughtful development of the policies than used to happen. So I really appreciate that. And on this policy in particular, he kind of spearheaded the initial kind of thoughts about what we should be looking at in this review. So thanks to Joshua, I'm sure also could help ask questions if there are any. So this policy looks at delayed openings and emergency school closures, both system-wide and for specific schools. I think we at Baltimore City, we have a fair number of closures that are also school-specific, often because of facilities issues. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And so there's kind of different circumstances in those different situations that we want to talk about. It gets into who needs to be at work when those schools are closed, and then the protocols for delayed openings and closures are the things we want to talk about today. So school and system-wide closures for 2017 and 20. So this just giving you an overview of the kinds of, again, there's two different types of closures. There's the system-wide closures for inclement weather. So that would be a snow day is the most likely one. We did one time for the derecho during a windstorm. I remember closing one time for that day when there was a lot of trees down and power outages. But the most classic one is a snow day. So you see those days here. And then we have school specific closures that, as I said, are most often facilities related. So you see on the right reference to a study that Hopkins School of Public Health did under the leadership of Josh Sharfstein, where they really did analysis about those school specific closures and the impact of the disproportionate impact on students in our school and students in higher poverty schools. So our schools there are schools that are missing a significant amount of time because of the conditions of our buildings. I think, as we all know, it's well documented, kind of the backlog that we have on the repairs to our buildings. We're part of a lawsuit, the Bradford lawsuit, to adjust some of the inequities in some of the funding. And one of the big areas you see that is in our capital buildings. And so we unfortunately do have to close schools for days when we have lack of heat in buildings, lack of air conditioning. That there's been a lot of work done by the operations team rather, to try to address that, the air conditioning. And we've gone from, I believe it was 76 schools that lacked air conditioning when I first started in this job, to now we're down to, in the low 20s, 24, I think it is, schools that still need air conditioning. So we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a number of schools that don't have air conditioning. So in some of the last days of school this year, for example, there were some really hot days there where those schools that lacked air conditioning needed to be closed because you just couldn't offer comfortable instruction for students and staff when it was 90 degrees or so. So again, the vast majority of those school-specific closures are a result of our aging infrastructure, either ours or the city's. We also have a fair number of school closures, individual ones, that occur because of water main breaks. And so that, a school can't function without water. So there's a fair number of them that are a result of that. So list of emergencies. So the delayed openings and closures of schools for the central office, those are, again, natural or man-made disasters. They could be the weather conditions that we've talked about, extreme temperature, hurricanes, or snow. This is the way the policy currently talks about them. The closure, the delay of openings, or early dismissals of individual schools tend to be non-weather related emergencies, such as a power failure, lack of heat or water, and circumstances in that surrounding area. It could be power outage in the area. So one question that we wanted to pose, since this is, we're at the early stages of developing this policy and wanted input on it, was should the policy expressly now, given the last year we had, should it be expanded to include pandemics or other health emergencies, or this year we also had a state mandated closures when the governor closed schools. So it seems like we should probably be updating the language in the policy to acknowledge that circumstance that before we weren't thinking of as much as a possibility. Next. So another key question in the policy is about essential personnel. So you see here the list of the essential personnel that are required to report when schools are closed. It's important to have these folks coming when schools are closed, because if you think about it from the perspective of say a snow day, when there's a snowstorm and schools close, the goal is, if we're going to have to close for a day of school, our hope is to get students back in the next day. But in order for that to happen, somebody has to be there to make sure that the walkways are cleared, the driveways are clear, the parking lots are cleared, and so that students are able to get back into the buildings the next day. So we at Central Office, our team, our grounds team and so on, they clear parking lots. The custodial staff at schools, they clear walkways and de-ice and make sure that ice is gone. And so and principals are there to help support and to make sure that that work is happening. And so that's really critical. I know a lot of times people aren't wildly enthusiastic about coming into a snowstorm to the school, but if without that, we wouldn't be able to open school the next day. So this is really important. And one question we have here is whether we should be adding assistant principals to ensure that there's building coverage and supervision in emergencies if, say, the principal can't get in. Maybe they're living in an area where they just can't get in, and so to have another person come in to make sure that the grounds get cleared for the next day of school is an important consideration. I see Commissioner McFadden's hand is up.
Yeah, I don't understand the rationale of principals being in the building. I could understand the building supervisors, the building chiefs, but the principals, just giving the age and the day that we're in with being able to communicate remotely, I'm just not quite sure of why the principal would be required, and then even extending that to the assistant principal if they're just in a supervisory capacity, but the building supervisor knows what is happening with the grounds and all of that.
So unlike other jurisdictions, we do not have building supervisors per school. So we don't, I mean, in other counties, they generally, it is the general practice across the state that there is a building supervisor for each school. We do not have that. We have recently reduced our ratio. It used to be 1 to 16, I believe. It is now down to 1 to 4, but is not 1 to 1. So that's one key factor. I mean, the bottom line, the reason why principals are there is to make sure that schools are ready to open the next day. It takes a lot to clear a school, to make sure the ice is gone, that you've gotten all sidewalks clear, that there is safe passage to get in the next day, and that you do want the school leader or a school leader to be there to make sure that it is truly ready to open the next day. We've got 160 different sites, and you need folks there to really supervise to make sure that it is in fact going to be ready. And so that's the reason for the principals. They're vital in this. They're high-level employees. They're well compensated to make sure that their school that they are the leader of is ready. Custodians are coming in to clear walkways, but custodians are not the leaders of the school. And so I think making sure that the school leaders are there to ensure that it's done well and safely, so that families and staff and students can get into the building safely the next day, is the reason why principals are there.
I understand your rationale. I don't agree with it right now, and I'm just going to, I want to take a little bit more time to think through it. But I understand it, and I'm following it. But I didn't want to take up time here because I know we've got the rest, and then we can come back a little later in the presentation.
Sure. I think the question about assistant principals is a legitimate question to me. I don't know that we need more people. I think that as long as you have a school leader there, I mean, one consideration is, I suppose you could say, a principal or their designee. I suppose you could do that to give some more latitude. I do feel like when it's hard to get out, I mean, a lot of the custodial staff are taking public transportation to get there, because principals generally aren't. And so, it seems reasonable to me that a higher level person should be coming in to check to make sure the school is ready. And so if I were the leader, I would want that to be me. I wouldn't be asking somebody to do that for me. I think you might have a morale issue if you do that, but that is one consideration that you could say, that you could designate it to somebody else, would be one way we could look at the concern you're raising. Next slide. Lessons learned from remote or hybrid learning. So obviously in the past year, we had to shift a lot from in-person we generally shifted for the year from in-person to virtual, but as we started to stagger in-person more, so starting in the summer, we had in-person, and then we increased that throughout the year to have more and more students across more grades and more schools in person. In those places, if there was a problem with the building, or if it was a bad weather day, we could close those buildings and then just switch to virtual. We were able to do that because we were so practiced at that time about, being able to, kids were used to getting on the various educational platforms. We had made sure that students had access to devices as well as to Wi-Fi at their homes. And so we could pivot. And so to avoid disruptions in schools this year, we were able to pretty easily make those pivots. If there was a power outage, I mean, in normal times, when there's a power outage, we frankly wait a little bit to see if it's going to get turned on right away so that we don't disrupt students' education. But in this case, we were able to. You can't do virtual learning or teach the students at home when there was a power outage. So we would just switch pretty easily to virtual learning in situations like that. So one question is, should the policy expressly authorize that kind of shift to virtual learning as an alternative to closure, depending on circumstances? And then I think we have a lot of questions about that if we were to do that. I think our current thought is that we would allow it as a possibility, but not require it, because it depends on circumstances. So for example, there has been discussion, I know I've heard in many school settings, the question of, is this the end of snow days? Do we have snow days anymore if students can switch to virtual? I don't think we should be creating a policy that says that at this point. I think for one thing, it'll be harder and harder to switch to virtual the farther we get away from where we are now. Right now, we're in a position where we can switch to virtual, and believe me, the value of not disrupting students' education is high. However, as we get further away from a virtual setting, it'll get more difficult to do that. So people will be we'll have more students who are new to the school district, younger students or students who are new to the district who will be less familiar with those learning platforms, and it'll be harder for them to log on. It'll be students who maybe haven't used their Wi-Fi, their hotspot in a while, and maybe it's not charged, or they forget how to use it, or they've misplaced the cord, or students who maybe left their Chromebook at school. So the farther we get away from virtual learning, this is going to be harder. I think it makes sense to leave the option, but I do think it can create inequities in terms of Wi-Fi access for students and computer access if we're automatically always switching to virtual. And then the other piece, which I think is worth mentioning, is that, and Commissioner McFadden, I'd love your thoughts on this as a teacher. I do think there's benefits to snow days in terms of just giving people a break. And so, believe me, I try hard to have us not miss school as much as possible. And I take that really seriously, both because I don't want to interrupt students' education and because important things happen like at school, like connections to other students, to adults, and the provision of food to our families. So we really try not to close schools unless we really have to. And I will say there was a genuine benefit to staff and students to sometimes getting a break when it snows, and you can get a little break in your education. So, or in the workflow. So that's just something else to keep in mind, is that there is that kind of psychological benefit to having unexpected little breaks that I don't know that we want to necessarily write the policy to prevent that from happening if we feel like it's a time when that would be beneficial. But again, this is an area where we'd love feedback from commissioners. And again, as a school person, I'd love Commissioner McFadden to hear your thoughts about it.
Oh, Allison, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm glad you told me. So these are the next steps in the process. We'll continue to do stakeholder engagement between now and September, when this comes back to policy committee for review. In September and October, we'll do more stakeholder feedback, and it comes to the full board for first reader on October 26th. More stakeholder feedback between then and second reader, which is December 14th. And then the next, I think, is last slide. These are some of the groups that we would engage with. And then some of them would be checking in, like with the Council of Great City Schools, would be looking to see what other jurisdictions are doing, or with other jurisdictions in the state. We'll reach out and see how they're approaching, days when schools are closed going forward. One group I noticed this morning that I neglected to include on here was the Charter School Advisory Board. So they would always be on one of the groups that we would check in with as well. And that is it.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Allison. And I want to just open this up because there are, I think, some really robust questions in there. And it looks like, I think, is it still only us here? Yeah, so how about Commissioner McFadden, you go first, and then we can just go off of each other, since I think we're the only two folks in their space right now, commissioners.
Okay, we can just go back to those framing questions, Allison, if you don't mind, if you could put them back up, and perhaps we could just go each one, each of the different blocks that had the framing questions there.
I think Joe is pulling it up. Yeah.
And I think the first one was the list of emergencies. And should the policy expressly include pandemics and other health emergencies, as well as state mandated closures? I'm processing all of this. I do think that they should be I personally think that they should be included. Just given where we've been, it kind of will touch all of the potential reasons why we would have to close school buildings. And I think that they should be, and we should specify, perhaps based on the type of emergency and the circumstance, what we do in response may change, right? Versus a weather-related emergency versus a health-related emergency. That's just my thinking. I'm still processing, Commissioner Brooks, Dr. Brooks. I don't have that many questions or thoughts around it, but I mean, we could go from framing question to yep, kind of guide the discussion.
I agree. And I'm in agreement with you on that. I think we should add that. I think that makes a lot of sense given the state of the world that we're in and the fact that while I don't assume that we would have another pandemic like this, it is clearly not off the table. And we don't know how things are just sort of developing in the world. So I think we definitely should be able to add that. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, so I think we're good there.
My question would be, why would we not include those in the policy? What would be the reason that we would not include pandemics or other health emergencies? Is there a reason, or was that just okay?
I can't really think of a reason. I mean, if the state mandates closures, we're going to have to close anyway. To Commissioner Brooks's point, hopefully we don't have another pandemic anytime soon. And I think some of these other descriptions, we obviously were able to close schools under the current policy. I can't really think of a reason not to. And to your point, Commissioner McFadden, I think you could frame out kind of some of the differences that might take place in that situation. But I can't think of a reason not to. I just flag different than we had in the past.
And Commissioner Brooks, if I may add, one of the things that you'll see in this presentation is that this is what we're calling a tier 1 policy. So this is the framing before we're writing. So some of the framing questions may have obvious answers, but we're trying to sort of tee up the big question just for, and so your feedback also about how we're doing this, I think, is helpful, as well as some of the questions are easier and some of the questions are harder, I guess.
Yeah, Chief Seven, I completely agree, and I think it's helpful to have a framing question to get us to be thinking about sort of what that's. Even though this one might seem like a pretty, I think, straightforward one, but the other one about sort of like messing with people's snow days, I don't know, which might have some more robust discussions attached to that one. But thank you for this. I appreciate that.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the essential personnel one, which Commissioner McFadden raised some questions about already, about whether we want to include assistant principals.
Here, I really think that when you all are doing the engagement, particularly with Pizzazza, I would really be interested in hearing their thoughts around this particular topic. I just think, and for example, if we're closing for whatever reason, and we still have the potential option to continue instruction virtually, in that same instance, the principal or the school leader should be able to continue to conduct. There are just a lot of questions that I think about this and requiring them, because they're not necessarily ground staff. They would just be making sure that work is done. And is that something that they need to physically be present for 7 or how many hours to do? Or is it more of a check? Are they required to go to the building at some point throughout the day? Do they need to be on site for the entire day? Are we still providing meal service to students and families? If that were the case, would it just be the principals and assistant principals present, or will we need additional staff to support that?
So
those are just some of my initial thoughts, but particularly with if I don't see the reason to have that person present for the duration of the day. Perhaps if the building service staff is there, and if they're doing their work, and if they're able to report to the school leader, and the school leader is able to make perhaps some sort of stop at the building at some point, throughout the duration of the day. I don't think that it's necessary, but that's my perspective. Someone who's had experience both in classroom and as school leader, as a building leader, I think I would be really interested to hear what Pizzazza says collectively, and not in the sense of just asking their leadership in this particular case, but actual principals that are doing and school leaders that are doing the work every day and who've been in this situation over the past, let's say, 2 years, like given the pandemic and also perhaps previous year in the way that we've closed schools for inclement weather. Because when we've closed schools, I think we've also served as meal sites for several reasons. So how do we consider staff in that?
Yeah, so for meal sites, what we've generally done in snow emergencies is we've identified certain we've pre-identified sites that will serve as meal sites for the area. So not all schools are open. We opened 18 schools during the pandemic because the school closures were so long. That's more than we normally do. It's normally more, I think we've done kind of one per quadrant, or a few more than that, maybe 6 or 7 we've done. And we worked that out ahead with the schools to know where they would be open. I think what I'm hearing you say is, is it a question of whether they need to be there all day? And I think one way we could potentially think about this is it a requirement for all day, or is it a requirement to confirm to be there to make sure that the snow is shoveled? I will say there has been challenges with this. I have had to close schools for a second day because when our teams went out the next day to make sure that the walkways had been cleared, they had not been at all the sites. And so it was enough sites where we did have to close. And so that's why, in my opinion, you need a higher level person, a school leader, to make sure that the school really is ready to open the next day. Because I have been in the situation where, 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm talking to the operations team who's getting out to see where we are and confirming that no, there's some stuff that didn't actually clear.
And I think it also, if I might chime in, depends on what's going on and what it's not just dealing with the snow. It's also dealing with if there were a number of field trips going on that day. That may be a lot of cancellation activities, or if there was events, or if there are key assessments. So the logistics of rescheduling. And I think that it raises the really good question about whether that has to be in person or can it be a remote in doing that. But that logistical piece of adjusting schedules and planning for coverage and the like, I think we should also consider as going forward.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say the last thing, and of course we will definitely reach out to Pizzazza and to some members to hear their opinions. I can tell you, I know quite clearly the last Pizzazza president's feelings on this, because I would get a call every day on a snow day about why principals had to come in. So, but I will definitely make sure that we talk to both Pizzazza and members, to your point, Commissioner McFadden, to see what ideas they have about how to make this work, because it is a problem. We can't just wait for snow to melt for kids to come back. We have to figure out how schools will be ready. And so what is the right way to do that? That's thoughtful about all the things that are on a principal's plate, but also make sure we get students back into buildings.
Yeah, and I think for me, this question about sort of once we add in sort of health emergency also asks the question, or begs the question, who's an essential worker? And so, right, so like, is there some way that we need to specify, for example, nurses as essential worker, or teachers in some particular like situations where, depending on the federal government sort of coding of who needs to be essential to kind of move this forward. I think we were clearly in a unique moment where teachers, I think in many ways, became essential. And that was not always seen that way. So I just would be curious about sort of either Chief Sivan or Allison, like how you all are thinking about that in the context of, this definition up here in terms of essential personnel.
Yeah, that is a good flag. I think, that had to do, of course, with the duration of of the, nobody, if you'd asked us a year and a half ago whether we thought that schools could be closed for a year and a half, I think all of us here would have said, no, I don't think that's going to happen. So it changed drastically what needed to occur in order to make sure that students were receiving the educational opportunities that they needed. And so you're right. And so I guess that is a factor too. Maybe that is a harder framing question we should have put in here, is that do you actually consider that on a longer term closure? Does the list of essential employees change? And do you establish that, or do you reference in general that there could be changes to this list depending on the duration of the closure?
So I appreciate that, and thank you for that that question and that thought, Dr. Brooks. I think what is sticking out for me is the term at the top of this page, will always be considered essential, right? So I think if we have that there, and I'm just going to go back to the point of the principles, should principles always be considered essential? Similarly to what Dr. Brooks is saying, in certain circumstances, will teachers be considered? So then if we see the bullet at the bottom, each year city schools may designate other employees as essential. Do we need to, I don't know, I just think we should think about who we are putting in this always bucket, given the different circumstances, and given that the system can decide based on the circumstances which employees are considered essential.
Yeah, I will just flag, so doing that in the moment is really problematic. It leads so much confusion. So it does have to be clear going into it who is essential, because I've been in situations too many times when there is some lack of clarity for some reason about a category of individuals, and trying to clear that up and work through that in the moment is very, very messy and very difficult. So I do think yeah, I think we just have to think carefully about how to do this in a way that, to your point, is sensitive to different circumstances, but is also clear, because a lack of clarity in these kind of situations is very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and I think sort of as we kind of move on to the next question, I just kind of like just I think the beauty of like having these conversations early is that we can start to sort of work out the nuances that might need to kind of live in a place, and sort of not that we sort of come to a solution at this moment, but between sort of our feedback and then sort of hearing from the stakeholders, that we get closer to something that's realistic and possible for us. And so I think this is one of those areas, and I would love to think about, as we add the health pandemic, the health pieces in there, how do we structure the policy that it's clear and also has enough nuance to allow when things are need to be tapped or activated to go to the next level. But yeah, thank you for that great framing question. We can go to the next.
This is the big one, huh?
Yeah. And I'll start, Commissioner McFadden. I think here for me, so I don't even know if I'm actually responding to the immediate framing question. I just don't want to lose the insights and the possibility of us leveraging as a district virtual technology to educate our students. I'm less concerned about whether or not a snowstorm happens and therefore we need to do that. And it would be great to have that option in that infrastructure. But I really just want us to not lose, for all the students who this has benefited, being able to sort of do schooling in a different kind of way, to have them still have an option and not feel like they don't have, because they don't want to go back to the traditional structure, that they are somehow disregarded from our system. And so I think for me, that's kind of this question. That's how it landed on me. So I don't have much to say beyond that, but that's kind of what feels like pressing for me. And would love any thoughts or
Yeah, so I mean, I hear you too, and I guess one just reaction I had to the way you said this, and is that I too, I mean, there was benefit to be able to. I mean, I have to say, it made it for an easier winter to just be able to say, okay, let's not, a lot of times, the team gets out and drives the roads at 3 o'clock in the morning to find out whether there's snow or ice. A lot of times there's not at 3 o'clock in the morning, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning. So there was a lot of tea leaf reading going into whether you close schools, and no matter what you do, there's going to people be unhappy in both directions. That you shouldn't have closed, you should have closed. Like, always, people are always unhappy. But so I have to say, it was a lot easier to just not take the worry out of it. Let's just close. I mean, we can go to virtual. It makes it a lot simpler. It's less stressful for communities. It's less uncertain for communities and staff. It is a lot easier to do that. So there are definite benefits to be able to do that. Again, I am just partly sensitive to the fact that that was a lot easier because we were so used to doing this, that it was just an easy, oh, we go back to the way we did it a couple weeks ago. Whereas if that was a year ago, people would be like, what do you want me to do? Where do I log in? That's going to be harder to do. One idea I had, and one thing that I'm sensitive to, and so I think Dr. Sharfstein's research about the differential impact of poor quality buildings on particularly our students who live in some of our higher poverty index neighborhoods is, they're the ones who are often losing school time because they have a water main break, or because they have no heat when they should in the winter. So do you then, for those individual school closures, maybe so that they're not getting behind their peers, do you more often switch to virtual in those circumstances? And I don't think, I really do, my preference would be that we avoid setting this like stone in policy, because I just think it's going to be hard to predict what we're going to want to do in certain circumstances. But maybe we try to lean to more trying to mitigate the inequity of students in poor facilities missing instruction by switching to virtual in those individual school situations, but not as often with the whole school situation when it's hard to implement across all schools. That's an idea.
And I think what resonates with me, Allison, about that is that, for me, that's like a direct intervention, right? So we see a problem, we can sort of try to address that, and then, then we can sort of measure its impacts against sort of are our students doing better, knowing that our infrastructure, and I know we have a pretty aggressive plan to try to get all of our buildings up to date and try to do all of those pieces. And in the meantime, this could be a really powerful bridge to get to make sure that our students in those schools don't fall behind any further than the others. So so for me, I don't necessarily have it. I would want to be able to keep that flexibility. I guess that's what I'm saying, to be able to use it as an intervention to make sure that we're moving forward. Commissioner McFadden, did you have any thoughts on this area?
Yeah, I am thinking. So thank you for asking. But I definitely, in that same vein of conversation, just considering what we've discovered to be the digital divide, and will we all have access, will all of our students have access to devices and connectivity in order to sustain this type of shift in the event that it has to happen? This is a more broad thought process for me. What does professional learning and development look like for teachers and school leaders in developing emergency plans in this way, right? So if next week there's a weather-related disaster, what is the internal infrastructure of the school to be able to do that? Or is this something centrally done, right? So do all grade levels do so for me, it becomes an instructional thing, a thing of instructional focus of, would we have the capacity to make that shift? So it's just something that I'm thinking about. And then, of course, do we have the technological and connectivity resources in order to make a shift like this without leaving any of our children exposed or vulnerable to not having some sort of continuation in programming?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I like the second point significantly. I think that's where I'm going more. So what will the logistical, operational, technological, family, and student well-being, and I think all of these implications are really important to consider. Yeah. In that next, I think it's not in this one, but when we see the engagement slide, I don't think that there is enough space in this for our students. And I know that ASCBC is one of our recognized groups, but I wonder if we could specify the way that we engage students around this. Like, just seeing students there is a bit vague, in the way that we would want relevant feedback and perspective. I would really be interested in hearing from them, because they were directly impacted more than probably anyone else in our context here by this past year and a half. And the way that teachers had to shift and schooling had to shift and meals had to shift. So I would really just be interested to make sure, and I'm just highlighting it, to make sure that we get a robust student response in this engagement process.
Thanks for flagging that. No, I appreciate that. And I think that you're right. We need to make sure we're really engaging students thoughtfully around this. One point on your technology question is that I think to really make sure that all students, what it would take to really make sure that all students have access to the technology to do this is significant. So unless we're going to have, we have in many of our schools that were in person, we were asking students to carry their, we're carrying their Chromebooks back and forth to school. We bought enough Chromebooks to make sure that every student could have access to a Chromebook if they needed one, but we didn't buy two. So unless they're going to bring them back and forth, then you would need a Chromebook for the student at their school, and you would need one at home. And then you would also need current hotspots, that are live and working with a contract at their home as well. And so not only acquiring that, but then maintaining that is a major commitment, that if we were going to do that. So it's just another consideration, is that where we want to put that level of investment in to maintain that. I mean, I suppose you could do it if if you knew a snowstorm was coming, you could say, okay, everybody take your computer home today. So you could try to prepare for it. But again, that works better for a school of 400 kids where there's going to be a water main break. You don't usually know that, but anyways, 400 kids or whatever, that's better to do that than it is for 79,000. That's going to be hard to do.
So are we getting rid of the devices? Are we not trying to move to? I saw you shake your head.
No, we're not getting rid of them. It's just that they are, the students will use them at school too. So they will, those are devices. Some of them came from schools. Some of them were purchased. We purchased, I think, 55,000 devices. So we purchased a lot, but some of them also came from schools, and schools need them to do instruction. So a lot of them will be in schools this year, and so not necessarily just at home for students. And so that would be a challenge if suddenly tomorrow, if there's flooding or a snowstorm or something, then their computer may be at school.
Chief Hive-Cupboard, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to, on the student engagement piece, I just wanted to flag a couple things for you. So we just did a bunch of student engagement, right? We had over 1,600 student engagement pieces for our R3 work, and then we're 5,000 for our student survey. And now we've lost our ability to sort of get student feedback at this very moment. But I just want to make sure you all know that as the school year begins, we are going to be doing some things to make sure that we get more robust student engagement and these kind of things on a regular basis. So one, having students sit on school family councils and being able to pull those students for polling or asking them questions and then getting feedback from their peers at school. Two, the youth ambassador work, where we're actually going to have our youth ambassador representing kids at schools to be able to give us feedback that way. And then last but not least, we're trying to revamp Campus Portal to be a direct way of two-way communication between the district and students directly. We have not done that in the past, or we've given students information through Portal. And if we get students in the habit of using it, we should be able to get sort of short surveys and short things back from them. So I just want to make sure you know that as we sort of progress, that's what that will look like, is how we engage students on other things as well. We don't have it this very moment, but this school year, you can expect to see that. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Great. And as we close out this presentation, just want to say on that last engagement slide, if we do the health, sort of the health considerations, that we should have some health professionals to think through that piece, or they would be good thought partners. I know our nurses might, and some other folks in the medical field. But thank you all so much. Thank you, Allison, for giving us a great presentation, and Chief Sivan, and for weighing in, and Chief High Covered as well. And so we'll go to our next presentation.
Dr. Brooks, that also made me, it just really quickly, it also made me think about transportation. So I think about how do we engage with our transportation partners that support us in something like this, like getting ahead of it before it actually happens. So I think this is an opportunity to kind of engage them differently.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
So I'm up for the next one.
Awesome.
Josh Sivan, Chief Legal Officer. So this is actually the third installment in an ongoing series of work that the policy committee has requested, and I think it's been a really good exercise for staff to be really attentive to what policy and regulations may have implications for our work to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then now we've added in the planning we're doing under the Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine initiative. And so we have, and in the materials that are available for the committee and the public, is a spreadsheet that goes through and highlights policies and regulations we think may be impacted, as well as some notes about considerations, even for ones that we don't think need to be revised or reviewed. And this is really part of an ongoing process. So just as background, we came to the policy committee in June and August of last year with a preliminary review, and this is the continuation of that work, and really part of and aligned with the planning that the other teams in city schools are doing around the 3R initiative. Next slide. So in the chart, we tried to color code this time in more detail, and we have 5 sets of possible rankings just to make it easier to look through. One is policies that and regulations that we've recently updated since March 2020. Another is the list of policies that are pending. Then red is high priority that we really need to work on before the school year starts. Medium is there's a likely need to adjust, but the changes can likely wait until after the school year commences. And then low is urgent action doesn't need to be necessary because what we're doing is consistent with the policy, but we want to be attentive to particular pieces in the policy in the event that there may need to be changes. Next slide. So as the committee knows, but just as a reminder to the broader public and to set the stage, there are 13 sets of policies and or regulations that have been recently updated, at least in part to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So not all of them were taken as emergencies. Some were amendments that we made in the process of the orderly scheduler review, and so last year. And so just to quickly summarize a number of these things. So in the procedures for appeals and hearings, BLA, BLB, and BLC, we explicitly include reference to conducting virtual hearings, which the board and their hearing examiners have been doing. We created a new policy, EGAD, which is perhaps my favorite for title of a policy or letters of a policy, for intellectual property, which was a need before that and scheduled before that, but there was a particular piece under federal law that we needed the benefit from to support our virtual work and use of virtual resources. And then there have been updates to the regulation around grading and reporting to address the challenges of the pandemic, as well as updates to the regulation around eligibility for athletics. Then we were attuned to the learnings from the pandemic in our family and community engagement policy, but that was also long in the making. So, but we decided to take credit for that one as well. And thanks for the awesome work of Tina Highcovered and her team. Next slide. So then there are a number of policies on the policy calendar for the 2021-22 school year. And the calendar for the year was really designed with an intent to align with our recovery planning efforts. So you just heard the framing presentation on the delayed opening and emergency closing. So, and we were clear about that, and it's tuned to the process. The review and revision and updating process has already started for the telecommuting policy and regulation. And as Chief Grant Skinner mentioned, when those were teed up, we've taken into account lessons learned from remote work during the pandemic and how we distinguish also between the emergency remote work we've been involved with versus telecommuting going forward. We also have a discussion of grading and reporting and updates scheduled for later in the fall on the policy committee schedule. And we have updates to the public gift and donations policy and regulation for a number of issues. But one is just that we've been attuned to the emergency nature of some of our donations and support, and making sure that we're able, when we have generous members of the community or beyond, that we're able to be mobilized to review and accept those donations if appropriate. So to commend the policy committee and the proactive work, we have not identified any policies in the red category that are critical to update, really because we've got those on the calendar and we're planning for that. That's not to say that something may arise, but that's our prognosis at the current moment. But we also welcome feedback if we've missed things from policy committee members and the rest of the board and the public. So then in the medium list of priorities, or the regulations and policies currently labeled as medium, we have 4 in this group. And this really is that we're going to, not necessarily that they absolutely need to be revised, but we're attuned to the potential implications of these. So one is we continue to monitor the internet safety and acceptable use of technology policy to look at, are there learnings from our use of virtual technology in the recent 16 and 17 months that we should incorporate. The second is the policy and regulation that deal with our school choice processes and entrance criteria. We've had to update and adjust the school choice process over the past year. We didn't in the end need to revise policy or regulation, but we're closely monitoring that. Then on academic eligibility for extracurricular activities, there we didn't have, given the different language and provisions, we didn't have to do an as emergency of adjustment as we needed to do for athletics, but we continue to monitor that. And we continue to monitor and give some thought to on the policy and rate on sex offender registry. Do other particular learnings about access to virtual learning platforms that we need to take into account. We've been attuned to that with some of our contracts and our visitor protocols, so we've adjusted them that way, and that hasn't risen to the level of policy or regulation, but we just wanted to flag that as something to monitor closely going forward. So in terms of next steps of this work, obviously we look forward to the discussion today. And then on the R3 initiative, you can see in detail in the chart ways in which we've specifically flagged how some of the initiatives in the executive summaries and the planning align with or are being designed to take into account particular aspects of policies and regulations, and we can go through any of those in detail. And we're going to continue to monitor as we flesh out and firm up the R3 work to see if there are necessary revisions. And then we will continue and commit to updating these charts. We've gone through 3 versions, and we suspect there will be more versions as we continue to adjust and adapt and be nimble in these unprecedented times. So that's the quick presentation, but look forward to discussion and questions.
Great, thank you, Chief Seven. Commissioner McFadden, do you have thoughts or questions?
Please begin, Dr. Brooks, for the sake of equity. You started during the last one. You should start this go round.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, Chief Stephen, I don't have like a lot of things on my mind as sort of what you've outlined here. I think what would be helpful for me and sort of thinking about sort of one, super excited that we have this the system that you sort of definitely shepherded and sort of highlighting which policies and which level, because that's really just helps us do that, and also prioritizing sort of the COVID response. That's been really, really helpful. I think where I sort of do have some questions about is this piece around sort of like, are there any insights that you can share about like our grading, right, and reporting, which I think is sort of really critical and sort of up and top of mind. I know we'll be getting to that. Like when we're trying to sort of engage those aspects of this work, how do you think it's going to be beneficial for us to engage sort of the presentation that you named? So I saw it. I'm like looking at it, and I'm interested in like specifics, but I know that some of that is going to be coming later. So if you have any thoughts about sort of how this time might be useful for you beyond just the questions that we have, that would be helpful for me.
So I think that one of the pieces we committed to doing in the chart, and it may be in too small type to digest, so I'll just summarize where we've been. So yeah, just and this is on page 5 of the chart. So the CEO has adopted 2 sets of revisions to Administrative Regulation JKARA on grading and reporting. The first was in April 2020, which basically authorized adjustments in grading and reporting consistent with federal and state law to promote continuity of learning in a unforeseen circumstance like this. And so then once that was put into the regulation, there were adjustments to the weights of different components in the grading process for hybrid and virtual, and that was important because of just the significant shifts we made. Then in May, so I guess I was going to say last month, but we're going fast, so that was 2 months ago. The CEO again used this authority, and we did a lot of work with the community, both in feedback to identify students whose learning had been interrupted due to the COVID-19 pandemic to such extent that they didn't earn a passing grade, and to promote recovery in those circumstances. So we have adopted, and I think there are others on here if we need to go into more detail, but just as the basis, the NC denotation instead of the U for grades 2 and 8, and the same designation was no credit versus non-complete for grades 9 through 12, and that is identified to prioritize personal learning strategies so that we can address that unfinished learning. And I think what we want to do when we come back to the policy committee led by Chief Dabrowski and her team is to really talk about the impact of that, and there's still more that we need to do. But I think those 2 moves, and I think through the help and support of really this committee saying you got to have your eyes on not just responding, but also making sure that you do it consistent with the policies and regulations, we were able to do this and also clearly communicate to the community what we were doing and seek feedback from our school staff in the doing of it. Is that the summary that's helpful to the?
Yeah. I mean, because I know that we were like, following along in sort of, those changes. And then sort of once, like you said, Dr. Dabrowski's team like to come back to talk about the impact. I know that's going to be a much richer conversation, but just really, happy to have a consolidated list of things that we're keeping our eye on, so that as things move forward, they're on everybody's radar.
Right, and just to flag on some of even the things that are not low priority, on some of those pieces, we just wanted to flag. For instance, we've got a community school strategy policy, ADH. So we linked in the summary, the executive summary that's come out, and we posted on our website on our 3R initiative. We linked some of the aspects of that dovetail to that policy, and I think that activity is useful to make sure that we are keeping and balancing our policies and regulations as we go. Similarly, thinking about and engaging with our curriculum and our gifted and advanced learning, and where we touch on those in the strategies are helpful. Or as another example, the access to appropriate physical education, the access to physical education. One of the pieces and components in the, I believe it was the wholeness executive strategy, was around enhanced access to athletics. So it's nice when all the pieces align, and I think that's what we continue to do to try to move this project forward and really be intentional about our notes for where we want our staff to be paying attention to. We always expect people to read our policies and regulations, but I think it's important in the middle of the work to actually be engaging with them.
Yeah. Hi, Dewana. Did you want to? I saw Dewana come up. I didn't know.
I did too. That's why I was gonna. I thought she was gonna chime in to something. Dewana, are you chiming in? Chief,
okay.
With these medium, the policies that have been identified as medium, I know that there isn't, based on what you all said, there isn't necessarily significant urgency around perhaps editing or revising those immediately, but I'm assuming in the event that something would have to be done, perhaps emergency, that would happen the way that we've given the authority to the CEO to notify us of if it were some sort of temporary or emergency that arise out of whatever the situation might be.
Exactly, and I would say that I think we've also tried to be disciplined, that there is a temptation in an emergency to waive all policies and regulations, and we've really tried to say we should stick as much as possible to what we have. And I think that's been helpful also to make sure we don't have more disturbance than needed given everything else that's already coming on. So while there, I think I said 13 sets of things that have been adjusted, most of those were actually part of the ordinary course they were already in front of you. And I think actually another piece that I was about to mention before your question is that this disciplined exercise has also allowed us, in the regulations and policies that have been coming up for review, for us also to be attentive to those issues and concerns. So when I believe that the one on staff misconduct, for instance, last year was already on the radar screen, and we thought about, use of email and use of technology was on the forefront of our minds. That's an example that comes to mind. Also, I can think of the data sharing one. We're more attuned to the fact that we're using more educational platforms, and so protections of student data and staff data becomes important. So I think the balance of the plans, trying to plan and give ourselves as much runway, but also being nimble enough. And so the example I just gave of the changes to the regulations around grading and reporting, that was one we said we need to move that one quickly. And so that's why we served up that regulatory change.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think it's also really helpful for, like you said, the public to know, that we are intentionally trying to move things forward to sort of help in real time, in some cases, to address for the pandemic or any other sort of spontaneous thing that sort of might jeopardize the district, our sort of ability to meet the needs of our students and our families. And policy is just one vehicle to do that, and making sure that we don't have any unnecessary vulnerabilities because of any thinness that could be found in our policy. So I really appreciate this and keeping it abreast for us as a committee, but also the public as well. And I don't have any other sort of thoughts and reflections, but just beyond a sort of a thank you for the presentation, and really interested to spend a little bit of time on our compliance reports. If we would begin to make that shift, unless you had something else to offer, Commissioner McFadden. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. So, so today we had, and one of the things that the benefit and the legacy of Commissioner James was that she really wanted us to sort of consider building in conversation around sort of our compliance reports. And I was happy to be able to sort of bring this along and sort of make sure that we've sort of honored that vision. And so I believe this is actually our first time really kind of engaging sort of the compliance reports that we were presented. So right now we have policy KDD, sort of a compliance report there, policy JJJ, which is about academic eligibility for extracurricular activities. And we have policy EBCD around those delayed emergency reopenings. And, honestly, so I'm naming that part because it's new and we are just trying to figure out how it's going to go. And so I hadn't really thought much about sort of order if we would handle these the same way that we would do just like any policy discussion. But
and it just so happens that it's technically only the two of us in committee for this. Right?
Yes, right.
But with this, Dr. Brooks, when I went through them, and I'm looking at KDD, the first one, I think that and I think now this is a discussion, so I just want us to have dialogue here. I think that if we're going to ask for a compliance report, I think we should be clear in why we're asking for one. And I say that because in the policy KDD, as I pulled it up, the only thing that it says regarding compliance is that the CEO or the designee shall report to the board annually in writing and no later than June 30th on the implementation of this policy. That's all it says. Mm-hmm. So is there something specific that we need as a board in order to govern and to make sure that there are improved student outcomes, right? Is there something that we specifically should outline in the policy that we're looking for? That question just came in my brain because do we need a report, a compliance report for everything, or is there something specific that we're looking for in order to improve the work that we do for the sake of our children? It was a thought that I had. Because of that compliance report, there wasn't much substance there because we really just adopted the policy in October. And so we don't, and we specified June 30th as the day in the policy that we would require a report. But we haven't even technically gone through a full year. So that thought came to my brain as I was going through that particular compliance report. And then just in the way that we're thinking about specificity, and do we want to do that? Is that appropriate? Is that the direction that we want to move into, or do we leave it vague? And are we focusing more on the regulation versus the compliance? But if there is a regulation, are we really looking for some sort of result within the regulation that's created? Or are you following what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. You said it very, very nicely, because my words tend to be a little sharp and crass sometimes. But I think you're right. We have not specified what we really need from this. And so when I was reading it, the way that I think about policy is that it helps me, or at least the compliance report should help me to know something more meaningful about what's really happening so that we can determine whether or not we change direction or keep things or writing a steady course. And I think for this particular compliance report, it was hard for me to say anything substantively or meaningful about sort of any of those things. And so if those are my three guiding questions, this compliance report begged the question, do we even need that for this one? But I do think about sort of thinking about media relations. I know that there's some stuff that we get that comes to, that's significant that will come to us as a board member that we won't get to the public to see. I know we have those types of situations, but But I know that policy is really about like stakeholders too, right? And it's about like trying to get a good read around sort of how people are engaging and connecting with us through the media platform, so social media and those things. And I don't necessarily want a report, because I think we get that as commissioners around just like numbers. Oh, so-and-so engaged this, or we got this much press. But I'm wondering, like, is there some way that we can quantify sort of what does this allow us to know about how better we need to be engaging with our families, with our students, and then ultimately, like, how does the presence of this thing get us to greater student educational outcomes? And so I would love a compliance report that would actually be able to do that. But I also know that some of that might be tied to the KPIs that we're also trying to, put together.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, to say what, maybe we do need to have a conversation around whether or not we want to keep it. And if we do, what does the compliance report need to look like for it to actually be effective and useful for us to make any governing decisions?
I agree. And I think as a committee, just as we're looking at policies, and even the one that we were presented with today, the first one that Chief Perkins Cohen introduced, as we're thinking about drafting these policies, what are some, based on board priorities that the community has helped us to create, based on these key performance indicators that we're thinking about, what information do we need back, to your point, in all of the things that we're creating now? Because I get, and we've heard that, just having a bunch of compliance reports, that can be a lot for folks to manage, especially if we as a board are if we're not using the information, but if we're not using the information because the information that is provided is not useful. So do we need to specify what should be in compliance to all of the points that you just raised? And I think that we have an opportunity now, as we're thinking about, as we're drafting policy and we're thinking about that, we should be specific about that on the front end, to kind of help us on the back end, because this just made me think, like, if we just adopted a policy in October, and we're asking for, October is what? We're in July, so 9 months, like something like that. Yeah, it's like 9. It's not even a full year. So it's putting it back on us at this point, from my perspective, to just be more intentional about the way that we are drafting and crafting policy, but also to get some support from staff in helping us to do that as well. Like, what will be the most beneficial information to help support us govern and do our work, but to make sure that young people are improving and better, to your point, as a result of what is being created. Because all of these policies at this point are being created not just by staff or by us, but all of our stakeholders are becoming more involved in this process. And so not even just us, what information do we need, but what information does the community need to make sure that we are moving in the direction that we need to move as a school system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also what you brought up for me, Commissioner McFadden, is sort of like literally as we're crafting the policy, are we having just a slide on the PowerPoint presentation to say also some potential sort of compliance report domains that we could be reporting out on, so that we could, in real time, as a policy being crafted, we could also see some suggested, and then we could be given some feedback. Also, we might be able to get some, broader standard expectations around sort of what that looks like. But if we saw just one slide, what folks were thinking about and compliance, that we could actually have some discussion about those.
Oh, I love that, and I know staff's listening. I think that would be a great thing to add to these drafts and to the presentations. I think that would help everyone. I think it would help everyone. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and so I think that makes sense too. I do also think another thing to think about is frequency of reporting too. So again, if you're looking at getting more in-depth reports, then doing it every year may make that difficult, especially if a department has multiple reports they're doing every year. So, looking at staggering them so that, some you really do need to know every year. It's a monitoring tool. It's something you really need to be watching, and we really do need to see it every year to kind of make sure that we're not really going off track. Some, it might be more helpful to go deeper, but every other year or every third year or something. So I think we should think about it in that way too, is to really, to your point, really give you information that's usable, that's informative, that could drive policy making, and what is the frequency in which we're doing it that would allow us to really get at a more in-depth information that you would find useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked what you're framing too, is okay, and then what are the other avenues in which you would get information too? So it's not the only way, this shouldn't be the only way you're getting information about things that are going on. So making sure that we're cognizant of that and not duplicating other ways in which information is coming forward.
Thank you for that, Dr. Brooks. With policy JJ, the 3 J's, the academic eligibility for extracurricular activities, I would like to hear from staff with this particular report, how it relates to the decisions that are being made in regards to athletics in the NCs. Is there a correlation? Is there a relationship between those two? And if so, why did we really just hear about athletics recently, as far as the NCs and the academic probation versus kind of athletics and extracurricular activities, if my question is making sense?
Chief Sivan, I saw you turn your camera on, so I'll give you the right of way here.
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay.
You should start.
Good morning. Good afternoon, commissioners. I'm Matt Griffin. I'm a manager in the Office of Teaching and Learning. Sorry, someone's trying to call me on Teams. I'm glad you asked that question, because I saw that Chief Sivan called out this report in the prior presentation he was doing. I think he could speak more to why that the athletics policy, which is very similar to this, was addressed, but this was not. But I believe, and chime in here, Chief Sivan, if I'm wrong, but I believe it's because it's mandatory with athletics, whereas it's optional here for extracurriculars. I do have some thoughts and feelings about the results on that report that I'm happy to share with you, but I would like to let Mr. Sivan provide a longer response first.
Mr. Griffin is 100% accurate, so there is some language in JJJ that is the extracurricular provision that says that principals can waive or adjust these, where that language has not been in. Now I'm blocking on the one for athletics. So there's more prescriptive language in athletics, but I think that's why we called it out, to, especially as we move towards recovery, to really be attuned to and potentially even thinking about whether there are benefits for firmer alignment, as Commissioner McFadden was implicating.
And my assumption about these policies existed before I was in this role, and that's why I say my assumption. But my assumption is that because of the requirements that come from, NCAA eligibility and things like that are associated with athletics, that wouldn't necessarily be associated with the chess club, for example, is another reason that we have that division. And if you look at the data in the report, I actually chose to include 18-19 as a reminder. We didn't do 1920 because when this report was due, we were in the height of the pandemic. But I included the 18-19 data as a reminder and kind of as a contrast to show that there were very few schools, particularly in comparison to prior years, that actually chose to reinforce those academic eligibility requirements for extracurriculars. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. We've been talking about that and exploring that internally. Extracurriculars at this point exist under Dr. Warren's office, the Wholeness team. But at the time of this year's submission, it was still under Teaching and Learning. But anyway, I think there's a couple things going on. One, it's harder than ever to implement extracurriculars just because of the environment we've been working in. Everything's harder to do right now. Two, what extracurriculars bring to students, which is, community, connection, closeness, is more important than ever right now. And 3, grading has been more challenging for students than ever. So, those three things, in opposition with each other, I think it's safe to assume, and I've heard that anecdotally from some principals, that is why they have steered away from that this year. And just kind of whatever extracurriculars they were able to make available to their students were done so with no strings attached. I can't tell if this is good, quiet thinking or.
Yeah, I'm just trying to I'm just processing, all of what you were saying. I think in general, I think that certainly moving forward for the next several years, we really need to make sure that our schools are well-rounded in programming and offerings. Because we've got to motivate and encourage and inspire our children to be in a school community again. And one thing that I've been talking to all of my colleagues about, like in a month from now, our students are going to be back in a 6.5, 7-hour structured day. And so what besides the academics is going to encourage them and motivate them and keep them interested and keep them inspired and keep them engaged. So that's just a part of the thought. But with what you're talking about, it's a secondary thought that I'm still trying to wrap my brain around. So I understand you really give the ability to principals to create their requirements for their particular extracurricular programs. But with athletics, I get the requirement there. So I get it.
Correct. And I want to stay in my lane. I don't want to go too far out of lane because, as I said, this body of work officially lives under Dr. Warren at this point. But just to call out some good things they're doing there, within the last year, they added a new ed specialist position. Her name is Danny Byerson. She is explicitly focused on extracurricular activities and opportunities for students. And members of my team, Josh Gabriels, who's our science, health, and PE director, has actually been engaging with her to pursue, for example, an esports program for students across the district. So we're trying to drum up some of that support at the district level in the same way that we have historically for athletics. We're trying to bring that same level of support and opportunity to extracurriculars as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, if I have any other thoughts or questions, I'll make sure I send them to you.
Please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. And I also had a question about this one as well, which is really, again, trying to help me understand sort of like, how do I take this information and use it to understand what this really means for our students, but specifically our students who might not necessarily have the types of grade point averages. I know that some of it's like mandated, but what happens for the young people who don't achieve those, but we still know that music, athletics are sort of core aspects of education for whether it's wholeness or the academic success. We know that interest sometimes leads to sort of deeper understandings of the world. And so I guess I just want to make sure that we're not excluding students from opportunities to engage, even if they're not performing in the traditional ways that we tend to know.
Sure, and that's a great point. And I think the response we got this year is an indication of the fact that principals are kind of sensitive to that as well. It's a fine line between these requirements being a motivator for students and being a gate keeping students out. So it's definitely something we need to be sensitive to moving forward. I hear what you're saying around what you all should be doing with this data too, and I think those points that I made about extracurriculars being more important than ever and also more difficult than ever to implement, I think those sorts of conclusions are something that we can try to provide in the report going forward. Just to be completely transparent, when I'm preparing a compliance report, I'm usually trying to stick by the letter of the law and keep it dry, not to exclude information, but that's just my understanding of what they should be, and it sounds like in this dialogue that maybe we should be going a little bit deeper, whether that's a small accompanying presentation to bring to this committee, or even just formalizing the structure of discussion, the expectation of discussion around these compliance reports as they go forward. So I think that's a great idea, and we can certainly follow through on that.
Great, thank you. Yes, I mean, I think sort of, while I think I know many of things, I don't know all of them, and I definitely don't know sort of the side of athletics, and or any I think that goes for any one of the things that we have. And so anytime I get to hear from the experts and people leading the work around sort of what they think is important and what matters, so that I can actually be meaningfully in discussion and sort of offer sort of my thoughts and reflections, from my place and what I know to this. And hopefully the combination will allow us to get to a deeper level of understanding and knowing, always leading back to better outcomes for our students. But yeah, so that's really excited to figure out sort of what these compliance reports will generate for us in terms of insights and sort of collaboration with our thought partners on the staff side. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And I guess our last one, Josh, you kind of gave a presentation on, at least talking about sort of the closings before. I don't know if there was anything else, unless I'm misreading my screen here. What else do we have there? Christian, are you there? Am I misreading my screen?
We just have compliance reports. I'll go ahead, Commissioner McFadden.
No, I think that was it. Like you just talked about Chief Sibin going through that, the delayed openings. That was it, unless we have anyone signed up for public comment.
No, we don't.
Okay. So I guess if there are no more thoughts or reflections that you want to offer, Commissioner McFadden, I think we could sort of begin to sort of close up this meeting. Do you have any thoughts or reflections that you want to share? I
do not.
Okay. So I just want to, again, thank the staff for putting together wonderful presentations and sort of helping to sort of to continue to color in sort of these compliance reports. And I think as we go forth, I appreciate the conversation and the discussion that we've been able to engage in around that. For our next meeting, we will be, it is on August 17th. It is still a virtual meeting at 3:30 to 5:30. The discussion will be policy JBA, non-discrimination of students, policy ACA non-discrimination, and another discussion on policy JICK, bullying, harassment, and intimidation. If folks are interested of signing up, you should know that these sessions are all public, and we welcome public comment. But if you want to sign up to be a formal presenter, you can do that at the beginning at 9 a.m. the Thursday before the meeting until 5 the Monday before the meeting date. And you can reach us by contacting our board office or emailing schoolboard@bcps.k12.md.us. Again, thank you so much for your time, and I will adjourn this meeting at 5 o'clock. And I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you at the next policy committee meeting.
Take care.
Thank you all.